Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Between Two Brokers. Today, we have Medium Hailey Lowe Fennell, and architectural historian Brittany Lavelle Tulla, and we are at this iconic home, according to Brittany, who has done the whole house history on the Battery in Charleston. We're looking at Charleston Harbor right now. This is such a special property, and we are going to chat with these two about the history of the place.
So before we get to history, Hailey, tell us how your process works, because we want to get, the ins and outs of the property, but you might be interrupting with some messages.
Yeah, I'll come in kind of with anything that I feel in the moment. But so for me, this is a little bit different than a one-on-one reading, clearly. It's more like a reading of the house and of its history. When you're in a house like this, there's just lots of footprints and imprints and energy that can stay behind. I always like to say that's a choice. You can either feel it or not feel it. Sometimes we'll have people that come into historic homes and notice the energy right away, and some people don't. I obviously invited in. So a few nights ago, it doesn't matter where you are, you can be anywhere, but a few nights ago from my own home on Wadmilla, I kind of set the intention to connect in with 20 South Battery, and I got a few things, and I'm going to be really interested to see if some of it checks out. I was actually talking with the owner, Dr. Schaefer, downstairs, and he was telling us a really cool story about the ballroom that maybe we can get on here, and some of the information that I came up with is already in there.
Quickly give us your rundown again.
Yeah, so I'm an architectural historian. I specialize in, I like to say I humanize buildings, old buildings for people. So that could mean house histories for property owners, like this one right here. That could mean helping architects and developers understand the architectural evolution of an old building, or to understand what kind of materials they're going to interact with. We work with nonprofits, we work with communities, anyone who wants to understand the story of their historic house and honor it, commemorate it. And this job is never boring. I believe every building has a story. Every single one, full stop. This one, though, had millions.
You guys told me an 8-hour episode.
Yeah. Here we go.
She has a 53-page house history in front of her to reference.
And it was hard to condense it to that. So I just want to, shout out to Dr. Jack Schaefer, who really saw the grandeur and uniqueness and just how special this house was, to bring me on board to help them really understand. No one's ever put this story really on paper. I mean, everyone knows about this house. There's little tidbits here and there, but to actually dig deep into its entire story revealed so many things that no one has ever known before. And this is one of the most iconic mansions in Charleston. So makes you think of how many other buildings on this same street we hardly know anything about.
I have goosebumps.
Let's go. Okay, let's go. So we are sitting in a mid-1840s merchant house. So it was built by Samuel Stevens. He was a very wealthy merchant who worked alongside the Ravenel family. And if you look on East Battery, you have many Ravenel houses being built at the same time. So in the 1840s, you're seeing this whole area of the peninsula boom. The city starts to sell off these large waterfront lots. We start to see White Point Garden develops. And it really is almost like a marketing tool for the city. They want people to build grand mansions along the water. And that is so that when people come into the harbor, they knew exactly what they were getting. This is Charleston. We are a power source. And Samuel Stevens was part of that movement. So the house looked very different, though, when it was first constructed. It was built in this kind of neoclassical style. So we are sitting in the mansard roof right now, which did not exist in the 1840s. That actually comes in the 1870s when Colonel Richard Lathers buys the house. And so just as a disclaimer, every single family was legendary that resided within these walls. So most of the time with house histories, we have many different people, working class citizens, middle class, upper class. Everyone has their own story. But these people, especially at 20 South Battery, they were changing both local, state, and national history. It's like, reading this history, it was like, there's no way. And every decade got better and better. So Colonel Richard Lathers, and if you interrupt me anytime you need to. Say that's one of the names that, so when I'm like kind of phoning in and closing my eyes, this is the coolest thing to be able to energize with a house and then have an actual historian to bounce it off of. Because there's nothing like giving a reading and then not having that backboard, if it checks out or not.
But one of the names that came up prominently over and over again was Richard. So I know that he's in the house and wants to make himself known.
But that makes so much sense because this was a showpiece for him. He was a South Carolinian boy. He moves up to New York. He's in New York during the Civil War, and he's a Unionist, though. So he's really trying his best to reach out to the Southern people. He's doing tours of the South saying, let's think about this. He's actually, I believe, in Louisiana when the first shots are fired onto Fort Sumter, and then they tell him, get out. You're out of here, buddy. Sorry, things are going on. And after the Civil War, he comes down and he buys this house, and he makes it into the Second Empire style. So he makes it into this popular architecture was like fashion, and so he makes it into the highest fashion of the era, and it's likely reflecting the things he's seeing in New York because Charleston was in ruins after the Civil War. And so what he's doing is he is then bringing people from the governors from the North with the governors from the South, and he's making them congregate in his newly constructed ballroom. And he's having the conversations of, let's talk about the war. What happened? What did you do? What did you do? What can we learn from this? And so this house was a means for him to bring people together. And I can see how just from, he leaves behind a biography, so we know a lot about him. And he was proud of this space.
And do you understand the information that's a little bit like the middle ground was met, but also not met?
Well, we know that he leaves, and a lot of people believe that he left because the Charlestonians wanted him out. But that wasn't the case. We saw that newspapers, he goes on back to New York, but we see that he often visits this homestead often. He comes down to the South a lot and comes and actually sits in this house with the current owners at that time. And so because he left behind a biography, we kind of know what his emotions are. And so as an architectural historian, I try not to put emotions on people, right? I try, because we don't know how they were feeling, but because we do have his words, we know that this really meant a lot to him to bring the North and the South together, because South Carolina was his home. He married a New Yorker, though. And so, and he was in commerce. He was in the business of interacting with different states and economies. And I'm sure he was very torn during the war, but he does come back and try and make it better. But he ends up dying in New York. The house we see today is what Lathers did. So with the mansard roof, the ballroom, a couple of other alterations. Mansard roof really comes into play in America after the Civil War era. So mid to late 19th century, we see it happening in Paris, the Louvre. I mean, this is a movement that is coming over from Europe and into America, like most of our architectural styles. Mansard roof is kind of like the house has a hat, right? It has kind of four angled slopes with a flat top. Does that make sense? So it's most people, it's Halloween. If you look at any Halloween card, you're going to see a haunted house with a mansard roof. And you've kind of could recognize that. For some reason, Second Empire, and I think it's because of the use of the ironwork and the wooden shingles. Second Empires and Victorian buildings tend to decay faster than brick buildings, and so Hollywood tended to make us think that was a haunted house. That's a mansard.
It's
and
like an extra story.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so most of the time, it's that extra living space. You'll see these kind of shallow dormers poking out. And it's a lot of other houses. You'll notice it now in downtown Charleston. You can see that in the late 19th century. Many people tried to, that was what people were doing with their architecture, showing their wealth through that.
Yeah. Keeping up with the mansard.
Yes, keeping up with that. What are we in the 1870s? Geez, okay. So the house then passes to the Simmons family, and they are incredible. And this is where the women really come to play. So Sarah Simmons was an older woman, and she probably was one of the most culturally influential women in Charleston of the late 19th and turn of the 20th century. She is the one that is hosting philanthropic events here. She is the one that becomes widowed very early on and is still keeping the house together. She's the one that's president of the South Carolina Exposition, the women's department. So I don't know if you all know that Hampton Park was this huge kind of mini World's Fair, 1901 to 1902. And she was in charge of the women's department of that. And so the plantation home at Lowndes Grove today was an exposition for the women of Charleston, where you can come and you can view women's history in Charleston by just walking through the house, different exhibits. And that was her realm. And she was dictating women from all across the state on how to really make this exposition loud and proud so that when women came to the expo, they saw how powerful they really were. And she could not vote. Here in Charleston, you couldn't really do too many things as a woman. If you were widowed, you had a little bit more liberty. When she dies in the 19-teens, newspapers are just raving about her, and she's an older woman at this point. But it's almost like history forgot about her in a way, because she was doing what she could in her domestic sphere and, of course, the exposition, but she was a force. And I really enjoyed unraveling her story because she also had this daughter-in-law who, if you know Villa Margarita, a few doors down, that was where her son and her daughter-in-law kind of lived. And her daughter-in-law was this beautiful woman from New Orleans, and she had the same name, Sarah Simmons. And so newspapers tended to focus on this beautiful socialite, where this mother-in-law was really the one behind the scenes, like navigating just society and culture. So then we have the Pringle family. They are the 19-teens. This is where a lot of trauma has happened in this house. And I won't say anything else, just see what you get. But the Pringles move in, and really it's Ernest Pringle's wife, Nell McCall Pringle, who to me is a power source. Her and her friend Susan Pringle Frost see what's happening throughout the city. They want to put gas stations south of Broad. They want to build skyscrapers, which, Francis Marion was technically, Hotel was technically a building too big for the south of Broad neighborhood. They're seeing a lot of development threats to their residential neighborhoods, a lot of what's happening now. And so they gather all their friends and family in the ballroom of this house, and they create what is today known as the Preservation Society of Charleston. And Susan Pringle Frost gets a lot of credit for that, which rightfully so. She really was also a huge power force. But this was Nell McCall Pringle's house. She hosted the meeting. She was the one that fought to save the Madigo House, Joseph Madigo House, which is now owned by the Charleston Museum. And it's ultimately her trying to save that house that actually kills her. She dies of panic attacks, heart issues. And we know this because she leaves behind letters as well, is that she's trying to get people interested in this old house, the Joseph Madigo house. We have to have people come see it. It's crumbling, and you can just see the agony in her voice, to the point where her doctors are telling her, you got to slow down, you got to slow down. And she dies of overworking, of trying to save an old house. And when I read that, my heart broke. Preservation Society of Charleston was the first community-based preservation organization in the entire United States. And again, a lot of the times you always only hear Susan Pringle Frost saying that there's another woman, and it's Samuel Cole Pringle, that deserves to be just as celebrated. And I guess last but not least, before we get to the Schaefer ownership, is the Tobias family. And Rowena Tobias, again, another just powerful woman. She is the one that's influencing a lot of gay rights here in Charleston during the mid-century. She is the one that is influencing a lot of politics, and she's labeled as a housewife in census records, and that is typically what happens for women. And we have some great images of philanthropic events and orchestras and things that are happening in the ballroom. But anyway, that was guys. I went on and on about that.
I want to just get you to quickly touch on the architecture of homes like this, because I do have friends that live next door, and when they bought it, the entire second floor was a ballroom.
Yeah.
How's about the homes back then had ballrooms?
Yes, socializing and was such. We're talking upper class, right? So there was a middle working class. This was not experienced by them whatsoever. But when you had this significant upper class here in Charleston, and most of these houses were showpieces for their wealth. Many lived out on their plantations around the peninsula, and winter was a social season here in Charleston. And so a lot of these uber wealthy individuals are coming into the peninsula during this winter social season. And now again, this is prior to the Civil War. We know the money is, being made by the backs of the enslaved. And so the money is just exorbitant, and they're putting their wealth in their architecture. And most of the times, the second story, we see this in houses from the 18th century all the way up to the mid-19th century, is that primary second floor. Oftentimes, you're going to get your most elaborate architecture on that second floor, because that is where the socializing is happening. Those are where you're bringing in people into your home You welcome them on the first, you pull them up to the second. This is where you're having balls, dances, dinners. Business is usually done on the first floor. And then, of course, as you go up, you have your private bedrooms. But if you look close, maybe it's hard to tell from the street, but most of these very wealthy early homes have potentially a full width ballroom on that second floor. And that's not uncommon throughout America at this time either.
I think like the most interesting things that you're bringing up is the history of all these different women that have been in this house. Because when you first walk in the door, there is like a prominent male presence. What happens oftentimes is when we know more about history, when the history of certain people are passed down, kind of word of mouth more and more, that energy becomes bigger in a space. But as soon as we bring up something that maybe people don't know that much about, and especially someone that's taken the time to do that research, the people that have just as much to do with this house will start to make themselves a little bit more present. And so when I was throwing out that intent a few nights ago to see who was there, I always do it in an equal way. And I try to do it with as little information as possible so that it's as unhindered as it can be. And I did get 3 cloaked women. And sometimes when we get cloaked spirits, it's not to be scary or anything like that. They're just saying like, hey, we're just kind of like hiding under other people's perspectives. People just don't quite know about us yet. So I wouldn't be surprised if when people come to stay here, if they want to stay at 20 South Battery, that those spirits might make themselves just a little bit more present if they've listened to this podcast. Well, let's see. What else do I want to say about that? There's a little bit of, sometimes we'll get different energies kind of with different spirits. There's one of those women that I would feel to be a little bit of a do-gooder. It's how she would put herself. Like she just really wants to be out in the community and doing the best by others and herself. And then a little bit of, I think you mentioned that one of them was widowed. Mm-hmm. And she kind of gives me some of those feelings. Those would have stayed widowed and not remarried. It's just how it feels. Yeah, so those 3 women kind of making themselves a little bit more prominent, a little bit more, they're going to probably make themselves a little bit more visible in the house in different ways. There's also different ways that anyone that's listening, if they feel like they have a haunted house themselves and it kind of gives us some of that fear and those scary feelings, there's really easy ways to just move past it and technically invite those spirits to move on. Just imagine walking through your house and you feel like you hear something and you kind of have this idea that it's something that is unseen on the other side. And then instead of walking through your house, you start tiptoeing instead. You're actually inviting those spirits in a little bit more because you're making your awareness kind of say, hey, like I see you. So I'm going to start kind of acting like this isn't just my house. If you want them to go away, just start practicing walking through your house as though it's yours. Like it is yours. It really is yours. If you want to coexist with them, you can walk through your house and also be talking with them either out loud or in your head. I do it in my head. But yeah, if you want them to go away, you can just walk through your house like it's yours. And it just tells that energy to go ahead and move on. Does that sound helpful? Mm-hmm. But here, if you want to come stay at 20 South Battery and you've heard what Brittany has said, you can kind of just kick off where she left off and just imagine all of the things that she said about these different men or women. And invite them to sit next to you. And really, mediumship is just as easy as having that conversation in your head and trusting that the things coming at that moment are from the other side, as long as it's not fearful. I think sometimes there's a little bit of a confusion between what the actual messages are from the other side versus our own ego and our own fear. So sometimes if we get a message and it sounds really bad or fearful or scares us, it's really just kind of our ego getting in the way, or it's our perspective. We grew up watching scary movies and thinking that ghosts are this scary thing. And so when we invite ghosts in, if that's still our perspective of how they're going to come in, they might come in like that first. They might come in like the old timey sort of the way that we would think of them being dressed maybe around the Civil War, the old timey women's fashion, that sort of thing. And then as soon as we kind of move into, well, who would they be now, or what lives have they had since that life, they might come to us in a different sort of visual and might feel a little bit more calm and less jarring. And I hope that sounds helpful to anyone listening.
Well, and so what Hailey mentioned is you can stay here. So why don't we talk about the home's current owner and what he's done and what it is today?
So this house underwent a significant renovation restoration under Dr. Jack Schaefer, and it needed it needed a lot of love. Not to say that it wasn't being taken care of, but it's a big house.
When did he buy it?
2018.
You're fairly recently.
Let me double check that.
And it was a B&B before, wasn't it?
Yes. Okay. So battery carriage. And so it had been since World War II, actually, which is fascinating. Okay. So the outbuilding was used as, and this was after Nelma Call Pringle passed. Her husband and her children began, to really see if they could subsidize the income because they had lost a lot of money in trying to save the Joseph Madigo house themselves. They mortgaged property. And so they began to open up houses in the carriage house out back. And it remained so. It was kind of grandfathered in throughout that. And I know there's a lot of people say they feel energy back in those. That those are original outbuildings. So we know how many enslaved individuals worked and lived back there, which is just powerful once you see the structure. But then it opened up as this under the Schaefer ownership, and the ballroom was restored, the interior foyers were restored, the plasterwork was restored. Everything you're seeing was pretty much taken care of in London. And honestly, it's become this grand showpiece. I know Dr. Schaefer really likes to carry on the philanthropic energy of this house. And so the fundraisers, the community coming inside, just as Sarah Simmons did, he has brought in orchestras, he has brought in poets, writers, artists. And it really is what Sarah Simmons did at the turn of the 20th century, is bringing in a collective energy of these different groups of people and encouraging cultural awareness of all sorts of things. That is being carried on inside this house. But you can also stay here too, which is exceptional.
I saw the bedrooms are named after some of the families that are, that's all Pringle room at least.
Like, yeah. And they're such a huge part of this house. We actually had the Hasty family coming in the late 20th century who, this is in pure Charleston form, related to Sarah Simmons and her family, so it kind of came back into the family, and they did use that as a carriage house in the back. And you talk to the individuals who grew up in this house, and you're talking high schoolers and college kids in like the 80s and 90s using this house, when their parents were gone, having parties. That's like, oh my God, could you imagine? So it was a family home. It always has been a family home, and it's been lived in. And I think that's literally what is so cool about this space. And under Dr. Schaefer's ownership, he is bringing the public back into this house. He is inviting people to enjoy the space, the ballroom especially, the outside. And I think it's such an amazing concept that, yes, you can stay here, but also that the walls of this house are seeing so many great creatives as well.
And I know there's some ghost stories.
Yes, so that's one thing that's always kind of carried on through the history of this house is, this kind of started in the late 20th century, is the spirited energy here. And we know that there's been a lot of death on property. We know that for a fact. We know that some of it's been natural causes, some of it has not been. And we know that there has been both trauma, sadness, but also happiness and love. So a lot of people, I think, have claimed to see people in certain uniforms. I think Colonel Richard Lathers, comes up a lot as potentially being someone that people see, but I'm interested to see it kind of like the underlying individuals. We know that Nelma Cole Pringle did lose a child in here, so I don't know if that's something that has ever come up.
Okay, well, this feels like a good time to wrap up this episode, but this is such an intriguing story and such a fascinating property that we're going to make this into 2 episodes. So between this week and next week, I would love for our listeners to do a little bit of research on you both. So give your Instagram handles or website, where people can go and read more about you. And then stay tuned next week for the second part of this.
Great. So my business is BVL Historic Preservation Research. That is my consulting firm that I own where I do this kind of work. I also have an Instagram. It's kind of long. BV Lavelle Tulla. That's just my name, Brittany V. Lavelle Tulla. And then, of course, you can Google BVL Historic Preservation Research and you'll get my website.
You guys can look me up on my Instagram or my website, which is the same. It's at Hailey Lowe Fennel. That's Hailey Lowe, Lowe, and then Fennell, Fennell, 2 L. You can also listen to the podcast where you can listen in on Fennell readings with me at House Guest is the podcast. You can find it on Apple or anywhere. And then the Instagram handle is at houseguest_ in the Holy City.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, thank you, ladies, so much for joining us. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe, and we will see you next time.